All right, folks, we're actually going to begin with Environmental Science, Unit 1, Paper 2, 2011 paper, specifically looking at Module 2. All right. All right, so Module 2, we have question 3. Figure 4 shows age structure diagrams for 3 countries, country X, Y, and Z. Study figure 4 and answer the questions that follow. All right, let's go quickly. Let's look at this particular diagram, these diagrams, to be honest. All right, for countries X, Y, and Z. Take approximately a minute or maybe 2 minutes, however you may like, all right, not too long, all right, and observe the shape of these diagrams. These are what you call population pyramids, all right, the shape of these population pyramids, for me, please. All right, pay attention to it, look at it carefully. All right, you can pause the video if you like. Now, if you look at the diagrams, we're actually seeing country X has a very broad base. All right, country Y, technically the base is relatively broad as well, but we realize that these areas here are actually being filled up. All right, and country X has a very narrow base, but at the same time, the whole pyramid is said to be relatively narrow, constricted. Now, the first question simply asks us here, name 3 types of population pyramids that are constructed based on mortality and fertility rates. Now, that being said, country X is in fact associated with an expanding population pyramid. Country Y is technically said to be associated with a stationary population pyramid, and country Z is in fact associated with a constrictive or constricted population pyramid. All right. All right. Now look at this carefully. Let's go down quickly into the other question. State one deduction about the population growth that can be made for each of the 3 countries. All right, so country X is in fact associated with a relatively high birth rate and also a relatively high death rate as well. As we can see, the population pyramid narrows a lot as it ascends. All right, this means the number of persons reaching this particular relatively old age of 80 years over, or perhaps above 60 years on average, is said to be relatively low. All right, senior citizens population is in fact relatively low, so your life expectancy and the number of persons associated with this particular population pyramid is in fact relatively low. All right, now that being said, an expanding population pyramid as such is in fact associated with a country which is said to be developing. It is not developed. All right, it is said to be developing in the phase of striving towards development. All right, now country Y and country Z, both of them are in fact associated with developed nations. Why? Because of the fact that they have a better grasp in terms of population dynamics, and the demography of country Y is in fact associated with a stationary population pyramid. Why? Because of the fact that the population birth rates are said to be relatively the same as such. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of people, in fact, for this particular country, for country Y that is associated with reaching a relatively high life expectancy. A large number of the population is in fact reaching to senior citizen age. All right. Also, we are seeing there's a big bulge associated with this particular population pyramid. Roughly within, you could say, 25 to an estimated, say 60 on average. That particular region there is in fact associated with the majority of the working class. You understand? So that is associated with a lot of people living, right, at a relatively older age. Now, that is in relation to the population number, that is. Now, for country Z is in fact associated with a constrictive population pyramid. As we can see, the birth rates are in fact relatively low. However, the life expectancy and the number of persons reaching that senior citizens age, old age, all right, in relation to the population number of country Z, it is said to be relatively high too, now, if you understand what I mean. All right, because this is a relatively narrow population pyramid. All right, it is in fact not associated with major growth per se. All right, I'm going to reiterate very quickly. Country Y and Z are in fact associated with relatively developed nations, while country X is in fact associated with developing countries. All right, in terms of the population structure and stuff like that. And I believe with that, I already answered this particular question. Which of the 3 population pyramids represent a developing country? And we have to give a reason for the answer. And we indicated it was in fact country X. Why? Because country X is in fact associated with a high birth rate and in a relatively high death rate, or we could say a small number of the population is in fact reaching senior citizens age, as a matter of fact, in relation to the overall population of that particular country. Now, very quickly discuss how each of the following factors may affect the human population growth rate. Now, let us begin with respect to age of marriage. Now, in developing or often less developed countries, if I actually were to use that term, all right, developing countries, which were formerly known as less developed countries, they often associate marriage at a relatively young age, especially for women. All right. And when women get married at a relatively young age in especially less developed nations as such, the fertility rate for the total fertility rate in that particular region is said to be relatively high, which will contribute positively to the birth rate. And if the birth rate and the fertility rates are said to be relatively high, it will result in a relatively high population growth rate. All right. Now, developed nations are actually a little bit different. Developed nations are often associated more, they are in fact more career oriented, more career driven. Hence, less emphasis is placed upon having large families or even upon getting married at a relatively young age. You have to understand areas where women are given less independence, such as developing or less developed nations in the world, all right, the age of marriage is often said to be younger. And in many instances, they are said to, someone be forced to have large families. This is actually observed in areas like Gambia, right, and Senegal, right, where the age of marriage is relatively young. Okay, so culture has a lot to do with it. Now, the second one is family planning services. All right. Now, family planning services revolve around that tertiary activity, which tend to encourage couples and families to make informed decisions, couples especially, to make informed decisions in terms of when it is time or when is the most appropriate time to have children. Um, Family planning initiatives are often endorsed and funded in more developed nations, all right, much more than that of developing or less developed nations, primarily because more developed regions or developed nations of the world tend to have a greater degree of purchasing power to invest in such a tertiary activity. Now, areas where you have family planning services, we tend to realize that the human population growth rate is said to be either relatively slow, all right, or is in fact associated with a low rate in terms of population growth, that is. All right, why? Because developed nations often, all right, pay much more focus upon their career-oriented initiatives on a very large, a much more collective level, whereas developing or less developed nations tend to invest less in this service. And people usually are in fact surrounded by, unplanned family upbringing, right? Where developing nations are often associated with high population growth rates. All right, keep that in mind for me, please. Now, thirdly, let's go through the government policy. Now, when we are talking about government policy, we must bear in mind this can either be conceptualized into two. All right, we have pro-natalistic policies, which is in fact a policy which is, simply influenced by the government of that particular country in an attempt to promote to increase the fertility rate and also to heighten or increase the birth rate of that particular country, primarily because the country is said to be associated with a underpopulation or low population number. All right. Now, that is for pro-natalistic policies. That is used as a tool to simply promote or to increase the population growth rate. While on the other side of the spectrum, we have antinatalism or antinatalistic policies. These tend to discourage persons from having large families. And in doing so, the government will put things in place, put little incentives or whatever the case may be, simply simply discourage people from having large families. All right. This is often adopted in areas which are said to be uh, very populated, overly populated. All right. And the objective with an anti-natalistic policy is essentially to reduce the population growth rate. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. Anyway, let's move on. All right, now figure 5 shows the percentage of people living in urban and rural areas in 3 countries. We have country A, country B, and country C. All right, look at your key. You're seeing the slanted lines are in fact associated with urban environments, while the dots are in fact associated with rural environments. Now study the figure and answer the questions that follow. All right, so I want to pay attention to this particular diagram, this particular graph. It is said to be relatively incomplete, and it simply highlights the population for the numbers for rural percentages rather for rural and urban. Now, folks, they've realized this is an incomplete diagram, and let's go through this very quickly. All right, look at it. The first country, which is country A, we have the urban environment is actually urban population, sorry, percentage is said to be an estimated 45%, roughly, right? While the rural population percentage is actually said to be 55. Now, 45 plus 55 is 100%, which is what that percentage is supposed to be out of. Now, you realize B and C, they actually give you values for B, they give you the values for rural. They didn't give you for urban, but that can be easily calculated. If we were to simply take a ruler and scroll all the way across for population B, for country B, sorry, it is an estimated 75% for rural. That simply means the urban population would be 100 minus 75, which will be 25. All right, make sure you draw with a ruler for me. Ensure that the thickness of the bars is the same. All right. For country C, they give us the urban population number, all right, percentage, and it is roughly said to be, yeah, let's say approximately 65. I'm actually using my finger to get it straight. In the exam, make sure you break out your long ruler for this. If it is 65 for urban, right, obviously the rural population number will in fact be 100 minus 65, which is said to be 35%. So once again, to complete this diagram, the urban population for country B would in fact be 25%, whereas the rural population for country C, which is missing, would in fact be 35%. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. Now, as we move along, assume that the population for each country is rural. We actually answered this question already. All right, this first part of the question, all right? Now, part B, part 2, compare the rural and urban population distribution in the 3 countries. Now, folks, if you look carefully in the diagram once again, based upon what we just said, right, we can determine that country A and country B, right, is in fact associated with a higher rural population percentage distribution than that of urban. That is for country A and country B, based on what we just calculated. Whereas for country C, the urban population is said to be higher, all right, than the rural population. However, all right, we can actually understand, all right, based upon the information that was given here and the information that we derived, what we just did for the previous question, part of the question, we can see that the greatest disparity in urban and rural percentage population distribution was that of country B, because we are in fact talking about rural population being 75%, while the urban population being 25%. That has the greatest disparity in the percentage population distribution for rural and urban, all right, compared to all the 3 countries. Keep that in mind for me, please. Now, part 3, very quickly, explain why the population growth in country B have resulted in the population distribution illustrated in the graph that you have completed. All right, for country B, that is. Now, it can potentially be that the rural population here for country B is associated with a higher birth rate and higher fertility rates, right, in comparison to those which simply reside in the urban environments, right? Hence the reason why the rural population is said to be 75%, while the urban population is said to be 25%. All right. So obviously the birth rates and the fertility rates would contribute to the population numbers in these particular areas. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, now part B is outline 2 environmental impacts that are in fact associated with the type of population distribution in C. And let's look back at the diagram, the graph, sorry. C is in fact associated with an estimated 65% for urban, while the rural population is in fact associated with an estimated 35%. Now, if you have a higher urban population, it is said to be associated with a higher degree of congestion. All right, urban areas are said to be associated with a greater degree of traffic congestion and whatnot. So in terms of the pollution that we can actually expect, we can actually expect a great degree of atmospheric pollution. All right, and this is in fact derived from excessive amounts of vehicular emissions, which can be spewed given the high congestion, all right, the high traffic areas, all right, in those urban environments. Now, atmospheric pollution does not only refer to gases produced, it can actually be associated with the particulate matter and soot deposits in the environment. Now, apart from that, we can also have an increase in solid waste, right? An increase in solid waste. Why? Because a large number of the population is in fact said to be in a very concentrated zone. Urban environments are often associated with concentrated, very congested, all right, environments. And as a result of that, given the large number of persons in that geographical area, you will tend to have a significantly high concentration of solid waste. On top of that, students, if you want to put a third point, it's up to you. I'm just saying. All right. We can even have noise pollution. All right. Urban environments tend to have noise pollution can be significantly profound in urban environments, primarily because of the fact that it is in fact a high traffic zone. You have a lot of vehicular, a lot of mobility, a lot of noise, which is in fact derived from activities, both economic or otherwise, in an environment, okay, in a very confined area. All right, so noise pollution is in fact a very, very significant one. All right. Now, part C, state what is meant by the term sustainable development. Now, sustainable development is in fact the term which refers to uh, a means through which a country or a nation or an environment is said to be uplifted, where resources can be utilized or consumed, providing that future generations are in fact not compromised. All right. So sustainable development, it is in fact a conservative means through which an environment or an area can simply be utilizing resources to the extent where future generations are not compromised and their needs are not jeopardized. All right. Keep that in mind for me, please. Now explain, part two now, explain how an increase in the population may affect a country's ability to achieve sustainable development. Now, folks, we have to remember the operational phrase is an increase in the population, secondly, followed by a country's ability to achieve sustainable development. All right, now, first and foremost, an increase in the population it can actually simply mean that there is, in fact, more mouths to be fed, which would mean there will be a greater demand for shelter, a greater demand for food, a greater demand for clothing, a greater demand upon manufacturing and industrial products and in even the processes as well. And if there are in fact increases in demand for these products, given the human population expansion, this would actually contribute to a greater degree of exploitation of resources, which could also tantamount to a high amount of pollution from these environments. On top of that, we have to bear in mind that we, the people, produce waste. Our total per capita waste will obviously increase if the population of that particular country increases as well. All right, so this is in fact the last question for Module 2, 2011 paper. Let us begin with 2012, Unit 1, Paper 2. We will specifically be looking at Module 2, Environmental Science. All right, so Module 2 here states we are looking at question 3. Table 1 presents data for per capita CO2 emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, for two countries. We have country A and we have country B. Now study the data and answer the questions that follow. Pay very close attention to this particular table for me, please. All right, I want you to look at it carefully. Take your time, observe what is being said. All right, take a minute. So that being said, all right, table 1, look at it. Question part E, define per capita CO2 emissions. Now, folks, whenever you hear the term per capita, it refers to per person. So per capita CO2 emissions is in fact referring to the amount of carbon dioxide emissions produced per person, right? Often derived within an annual period, right? It is often given a numerical value within a specific period, which is technically within 1 year period, all right? Because this could vary from time to time. All right. The reason why per capita emissions are often referred to under an annual period, it can be accountable. We can actually understand the level of change that is associated with it. All right. As the progression of time, with the progression of time. Now, part B here, all right, is in fact calculate the total per capita CO2 emissions for both countries. Now, class, if they are in fact asking us for the total per capita CO2 emissions, you will simply take the per capita CO2 emissions and you will actually multiply it by the total population. All right. All right. So let's go through this very quickly for country A. 8.3 multiplied by 8,500, yeah, 8,580. All right, you will actually be given a value of 71,000, all right, 214 million, all right, kilograms. So everybody here write the new one. Now, if it is 71,214 million kilograms, all right, and you put what I'm saying, this is actually in brackets, right? This is essentially saying 71 billion 214 million kilograms. All right. Listen carefully what I'm saying. All right. Because when you are saying you have to include these units, which is in brackets here, to minimize the clutter of numbers, you simply put the units in brackets. Hence the reason why I didn't put the bunch of zeros for the millions here. It is already given a unit. All right. So it will be 71,214 million kilograms in brackets. You put million kilograms. All right. This is the same thing as saying 71 billion 214 million kilograms. All right. Listen to me. You understand what I'm saying? Now the second one, all right, 71.5 multiplied by 1,465. Let us see quickly. All right, so this would actually be 104, all right, 747.5, open brackets, million kilograms. You put that in brackets for me. Make sure you put that in brackets. All right, so I'm going to say that again. It is in fact 104, 747.5 million kilograms. All right, make sure you put units. If you do not put your units, you will get it wrong. All right, you understand what I'm saying? So we can automatically see country B does in fact have a higher total per capita CO2 emission. And that actually answers part B. Based on the results of the calculation in B1, which of the two countries will the CO2 emissions most likely have a greater impact on the environment? The answer would definitely be country B. All right, let's go down quickly. Now, when assessing, this is part C now, when assessing the relationship between people and the environment, consideration must be given to abiotic and biotic factors. With reference to this statement, explain how each of the following can affect the distribution and activity of human population. Now, the first one is extremes in temperature. Now, folks, when we are talking about extremes in temperature, it can either be too hot or it can either be too cold. Now, in terms of areas which are said to be too hot or too cold, essentially referring to deserts. Yes, we have hot deserts and we also have cool deserts. Antarctica is a barren landscape of ice. That is a cool desert. Whereas hot deserts include like the Sahara, the Namib Desert, the Atacama Desert, and stuff like that, the Gobi Desert, etc. Now, extremities in temperature, extreme temperature conditions can actually be very can be considered to be a climatic challenge, all right, to many areas, many persons, all right, and hence it might act as a deterrent. Cold areas, the acquisition of food and even mobility can be hindered because of the blizzard-like conditions, right, which can actually debar the expansion and also the acquisition of food, like I indicated, and also the mobility of an individual or individuals. All right, there's a lot of uncertainty which surrounds it. Now, very, very hot conditions are in fact associated with areas which are said to be drought-like. Right? For example, deserts are often limited when it comes to moisture receipts, and this can actually be very detrimental or very dangerous, especially if you have, if perhaps, if they are in fact said to have large population numbers, which in reality, these extreme temperature conditions and these areas which experience these are often associated with a relatively low population distribution, and even the activity, right, can be hindered because agriculture cannot be properly executed in very harsh conditions which are said to be cold, or even very harsh conditions which are said to be too hot and dry. All right, the activity will also be influenced by the amount of resources that is in fact available. All right, even the extremities in temperature can actually hinder persons. Now, in terms of the fertility, the soil fertility, right, which is part two, the fertility of the soil, right? Fertile soils, for instance, can actually attract people towards that particular area. For example, fertile soils can be used to encourage primary economic activities, specifically referring to like agriculture, right? And that is in fact a major economic activity which actually holds the settlements, right, and the population numbers at bay, right? People tend to gravitate towards areas which are said to be fertile. All right, areas which are said to be futile and is associated with low nutrient content, those areas are often considered to be deterred environments. All right, people tend to be deterred from conditions as such. All right, so fertile conditions are, they often attract populations, and the activities are significantly agronomic. All right, whereas futile or useless environments, FUTILE, all right, those conditions are in fact associated with low population distribution as well. Now, part D, very quickly, discuss two reasons why some people believe that poverty tends to encourage population growth. Now, first and foremost, number one, poverty, some people have the wrong ideological perspective that if they tend to have large families, it can be an opportunity to exit or to escape the clutches of poverty, with the false assumption that larger populations or larger persons in the household, larger number of persons in the household, basically, would in fact be a lot more persons allowed to work. Hence, they can bring in a lot of money and they will be able to exit poverty. But in reality, that is not the case. All right, in reality, the larger population number, household numbers, all right, will tantamount to more mouths to feed, more resources to acquire, and that will actually put an economic strain upon the government. All right, that's one. Now, secondly, all right, some people believe that poverty is actually a major encouragement to population growth because poor conditions or poor environments cannot, right, simply afford proper family planning services. They don't have the expenses for that. As a matter of fact, they don't even see it as a criteria, primarily because it is not considered to be a basic necessity to them. All right. Family planning initiatives might be seen as a luxury instead of a necessity, but in reality, areas which are poverty stricken, there is nothing to debar, right, the population from exploding. All right. Poverty is also associated with areas where the use and even the acquisition of contraceptives and birth controls can be limited. All right. And as such, people would not be willing to pay for something like that, primarily because they have to focus upon more immediate things, such as food and general survival. All right. Okay. All right, so table 2, question 4 presents data on environmental impact of overconsumption and natural resources in the country A and B. Study the data and answer the questions that follow. Look at the table for me. Take approximately a minute or two, all right, understand what the table is saying. You are seeing the environmental impact of overconsumption, inclusive of deforestation, introduction of exotic species, pollution, and we are actually seeing the impact associated with country A and country B. All right. Medium, high, no impact, low, high. All right, so keep that in mind. Focus on this for approximately a minute or two. All right, let's go through quickly in part A, part 1. In which country will there be a greater impact on natural habitats? Give a reason for your answer. Now, folks, when we are talking about habitats, deforestation leads to degradation to the habitat. Introduction of exotic species or invasive species can also contribute to habitat destruction or habitat fragmentation. Destruction, my bad. Even pollution can lead to destruction. Now, which country will be a greater impact? Now, class, if we look at country A and country B, let us go down. We are seeing medium for country A, high, and also low. All of these do have an impact. All right, all of the environmental parameters in this regard, the effects, that is deforestation, exotic species introduction, and also pollution, all of them have an impact on country A. But for country B, we're actually seeing medium, right? For deforestation, the impact is medium. The introduction of exotic species tantamount to no impact on country B. That's zero impact. And also it is high for the pollution. Now, I would say country A will have a greater impact upon, there will be a greater impact upon country A on its natural habitats. And the reason being is because when you compare country A to country B, all of the parameters, inclusive of deforestation, introduction of exotic species, and pollution, all of them at some level possess degrading impacts upon country A, while only two had an impact upon country B, referring to both deforestation and pollution. Only exotic species did not have an impact. So country A will be the country which will in fact be associated with a greater impact. All right, let's go through quickly. Now, in which country, part 2 here, which country will there be a greater displacement of native species? Now, let's go back in the diagram here. You got to give a reason as well, all right? When they talk about a greater displacement, the table that is, displacement meaning the actual organisms can actually, native organisms can be removed from the natural environment forcefully. All right. And yes, we understand pollution will have an impact, but in terms of actual displacement, deforestation can contribute to habitat fragmentation, and the animals can be forced to flee further inwards into the environment, to the habitat, which is in a very constrictive manner, to the point where they have to be against the wall in a sort of scene, right? So deforestation is medium for both of them, and also the introduction of exotic species would in fact contribute to the native species being outcompeted. That will actually be country A. All right, country A. All right. So the reason for that is because why would there be a greater displacement? Which country? Because country A is associated with medium and high impacts for deforestation, from deforestation and the introduction of exotic species, respectively, while country B only had an impact for deforestation if you were taking into consideration those two parameters only. All right. Now, part B outline one way in which change in lifestyle can mitigate the impacts. Mitigate means to reduce the impacts identified in table 2. Now, first and foremost, in terms of our levels of consumption, if we reduce our levels of consumption and we employ a more conservative approach, all right, where we use resources sparingly, all right, we can simply reduce the impacts as it relates to the impacts of pollution, all right, and also as it relates to deforestation, because consumption doesn't necessarily mean physical consumption or for physical, to actually eat. It means to utilize as well. All right. And when we tend to expand and we utilize large land masses for a wide variety of activities, we are essentially impacting upon the environment. Okay. Now, part C is in fact a blatant repeat from 2011 paper. All right. This is a repeat. It was mentioned a couple of minutes ago. Part D explain how the high fertility rates may impact on a country's ability to achieve sustainable development. There's a question which kind of similar to that before in 2011. Let's go through this quickly. Now, high fertility rates can often contribute to high birth rates, meaning that the amount of dependence, right, would in fact increase for that particular country. That would require a greater, that would mean there would be a greater demand for resources, which would in fact require increases in the manufacturing processes and also industrial processes, and the acquisition, all right, of resources would be in great demand, as I indicated earlier. As a result of this, we would tend to try to expand these processes in terms of manufacturing, production, even agriculture, and even our physical or lateral space on the landmass. We will expand our range to cater for the increase in the population, which will be influenced by the fertility and also the birth rates. As a result of that, we would contribute more to habitat fragmentation, to resource degradation, all of which are not regarded as conservative or sustainable measures. Hence, sustainable development would be compromised. All right. Now, Part E suggests an appropriate fertility rate that would allow Caribbean countries to achieve sustainable development. There is a concept known as the replacement level fertility. All right, that is a numerical value of 2.1, which technically allows the replacement of the previous generation. So the appropriate fertility rate of 2.1 would be ideal, right, for the Caribbean countries to achieve sustainable development. And in terms of justification of that particular answer, I would simply say that 2.1 refers to the replacement level fertility, which is in fact that value which can ultimately allow, all right, the existing offsprings or children being born, all right, the average number of children being born, they would technically replace the previous generation. All right, not too high, and at the same time, not too low. Anything above 2.1 is tantamount to increases in the population. All right, anything which is lower than 2.1 can contribute to underpopulation eventually, or a potential population decline. But when we are talking about sustainable development, we are allowing ourselves to not exceed any particular population threshold. So 2.1 is said to be an acceptable value, which is essentially the replacement level fertility. All right, students, this is in fact the last question for 2012 paper for Module 2. Well, let us begin quickly with respect to 2013 paper, Environmental Science, Unit 1, Paper 2, Module 2. Now, the first part of the question is simply question 3A, that is, distinguish between Human Development Index and Gender Development Index. Let's go through quickly. All right, so Human Development Index is in fact a term, all right, or a concept or an indicator which basically takes into consideration, all right, several parameters inclusive of life expectancy, education and literacy, of course, as well as gross domestic product per capita. All right, and those three main parameters, all right, are in fact collectively measured to actually give us the Human Development Index to determine if the social construct of any given society or environment, all right, is in fact considered to be socially developed. All right. Now, Gender Development Index. Gender Development Index is in fact a very significant measure, right, which is in fact associated with, like, comparisons, right, between the male and female, all right, both genders, as a matter of fact. It in fact measure the gender gaps, right, between, or levels of disparities which exist between both males and females, men and women respectively. All right, and it takes into consideration, well, the same parameters associated with the HDI, inclusive of the living standards of both males and females, comparing them simultaneously at some point. It also takes in consideration health as well as educational knowledge. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. Now, Part B, explain how each of the following factors may affect human population density. Now, we spoke about distribution in 2012 paper, I believe, about how climate influences it. Now, if the climate is said to be favorable, for example, warm, all right, they will tend to have a great degree of high population numbers in specific areas, allowing or contributing to high population density. All right. However, if the climatic conditions are said to be very harsh, right, either referring to very frigid or very cold conditions, or perhaps extremely hot and dry conditions, all right, these environmental conditions can, in fact, uh, inhibit, or I shouldn't say inhibit, but in reality, it can actually reduce the range and the overall spread as well as the density of population structures, all right, in any given area. It can actually deter very harsh environmental or climatic conditions can simply deter high population numbers in any given area for that matter. All right, if you were to look at, for example, in the Antarctic as well as the Arctic, we realize we have a relatively low population number in comparison to areas like in the tropics, or you understand what I'm saying, within the warm tropical or Caribbean environment. Now, economy, right? Economy is in fact a very important one, right? People tend to gravitate towards areas which are said to be much more economically productive. Hence the reason why areas which are said to be economically diverse and productive would in fact attract high population number, and which would tantamount into high population densities in specific areas. However, if the economy is said to be relatively poor, all right, that will actually contribute to a push factor out of that region. People will tend to migrate out of that environment in an attempt or in a quest to acquire betterment. All right, so economies which are said to be relatively low, all right, progressively, given migration, the concept of migration, it can actually contribute to low population density. However, on a flip side, areas which are associated with very well poor nations, for example, which often lack uh, family planning initiatives and stuff like that, these areas are often at a disadvantage. And in reality, the culture would be to simply have a large number of family in a very unaccountable manner. All right, large numbers in terms of the large families, sorry. All right, so it depends on how you look at it. It can actually swing both ways, to be honest. All right. Now, part C, all right, table 2 shows the percentage of people residing in urban areas in 3 countries. We have the from 1960 to the year 2000, all right. We have country A, B, and C. We have the percentage values mentioned here. All right. Technically, these are in fact 20 years apart from each significant period. All right. Now, describe the trend of urbanization for each country as shown by the data in table 2. All right, look at the table. Take a minute or two and look at the table for me. Now, if you look carefully, right, if you look carefully at country A and country B, you would observe, right, country A and country B, both of them are in fact associated with progressive increases in terms of their population, people residing in the urban environments, and which is in fact associated with progressive increases. As you can see from country A, it ranged from 24 to 35 to 55 respectively for those for 1960 straight up to the year 2000. Whereas for country B, it ranged from 58 to 65 to 75. That is also a progressive increase. All right. Now both of them are in fact associated with increases. All right. While for country C, we realized that there was in fact a slight hiccup, a mild fluctuation, right, where the population dropped, right, in from the year 1960 to the year 1980 in terms of people residing in urban areas by an estimated 2%, right, which is from 72% in 1960 to 70% in 1980, which was then subsequently associated with an increase by 5% in by the year 2000, sorry. Now, there was in fact a small change associated with country C. The smallest change, even we talk about fluctuation here, was associated with country C. As you can see, all these values were maintained in the 70s, regardless of the fluctuation. However, if you look at country A and B, all right, for country A and B, the greatest rate of increase was in fact associated with country A. All right, if you were to look at it from a general perspective from 1960 all the way up to the year 2000. All right, keep that in mind for me, please. All right, so part 2 here, the total number of people of country B in 1980 was 7.5 million. Calculate the number of people from country B who lived in rural areas in 1980. That is for 3 marks. Let's go through this quickly. All right, so for country B, right, in the year 1980, right, the amount of person living in percentage was in urban areas was 65. That means 35 was actually living in rural. So technically, if the total population is 7.5 million, the amount of persons living in rural will technically be 35% multiplied by 7.5 million people. That would essentially be 2,625,000 people. All right. Or in other words, 2.625 million people. All right. I'm going to say that again. That will either be 2,625,000 people or 2.625 million people. Or you want to put it the same, it doesn't matter. All right, let's go through quickly. The pictures below depict environmental issues associated with urbanization. All right. Let us get a proper view of these pictures. We see in W, X, Y, and we see in Z. Now, W is in fact associated with aquatic pollution. All right. X is in fact associated with land pollution, as you can see it here. Y, we are actually seeing rats, so that would be associated with the diseases. All right, and pests. While Z is in fact associated with traffic congestion. All right, which will also tantamount to atmospheric pollution given the emissions from these vehicles. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, so let's go through. Identify 2 environmental impacts depicted from the pictures. All right, now first of all, we understand that we said W is aquatic pollution. All right, no, X, sorry. Yeah, W is aquatic pollution, my bad. X is land pollution, Y is in fact pests and diseases, and also we have Z is atmospheric pollution. So we already mentioned that. Now, explain one way in which one of the impacts identified in D1 may be mitigated or reduced. Now, class, let's go through this very quickly. I'm going to go through all. A way in which we can actually reduce water pollution is water pollution and land pollution. We can simply employ proper legislative measures. All right, for both X and W and X. All right, we can employ proper legislative measures where hefty penalties and fines can be imposed, especially for those who are in breach of the law. Technically, that can act as an economic deterrent against polluting the environment. So people could actually be forced to adopt a specific sustainable culture. For W, right, in terms of organic waste disposal and proper sanitization, all right, of any given environment, we can reduce the influx of vermin and by extension, pests and diseases. For Z, right, which is associated with congestion, all right, one way of mitigating these effects associated with Z, which is atmospheric pollution and stuff like that, and soot and particles matter in the atmosphere, which is typically associated with Z here, all right, we can understand that that particular concept is associated largely with urban environments. So in many instances, to reduce the effect of this, there can in fact be decentralization, all right, where businesses can actually be relocated in areas closer to different sub-regions, or different subsidiaries can be established in different areas. In an attempt, by doing this, you can actually reduce the influx of persons and the length of time people have to simply traverse from one area to the next. Also, there can in fact be in another mechanism we can employ is adopting, right, the use of what we call a mass transit system, and a very efficient mass transit system, right? For example, in different parts of the world, they use electric trains, and this is in fact very, very important, right? Where the electric trains basically does not emit as much, or perhaps it doesn't emit any fossil fuels, the emissions at all for that matter, right? It doesn't consume fossil fuels as a matter of fact. So just keep that in consideration for me, please. Now, let's go through quickly. Now, figure 4 shows the total fertility rates of women in a country who are educated at different levels. Now, students, pay attention to the graph. Take approximately 1 minute and look at this graph for me, please. All right, you can pause the video if you have to. Now, the total fertility rate is on the y-axis, and in terms of the education status of women, it is in fact associated on the x-axis. We see in primary, secondary, university for 2 years, 4 years, and 6 years in that order. Now, the first question simply asks us, all right, state 4 deductions that can be made from the graph about the relationship between total fertility rate and the education of women. Now, first and foremost, we can understand that The highest fertility rate is in fact associated with primary school education only. All right. Whereas the lowest fertility rate is in fact associated with persons with university education, be estimated 6 years. All right, there's one. The total fertility rate for those women who possess primary education, all right, is in fact 3 times higher than those who possess university education for 6 years. That's two. Thirdly, university education level at 2 years and at 4 years respectively, both of them basically tantamount to the same total fertility rate, all right, which is higher than that for university level at 6 years education, and but lower than primary and secondary in that order. All right. Number four now, we can simply observe, right? We can simply observe that the total fertility rate, all right, for university level for second and 4 years, all right, of education is in fact an estimated well, it is in fact 2 times greater, all right, than that of university level at 6 years. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. Very basic. All right, so this diagram, this graph actually shows that the more it actually highlights that the more educated women are, all right, technically, the total fertility rate on average will tend to decline. Okay, so just two reasons, right, that can explain the relationship between total fertility rate and the level of education of women. Now, first and foremost, we must bear in mind that educated women are in fact those who are associated with a greater degree of independence, and in fact, this would be associated with them trying to solidify and acquire a better standard of living by striving for betterment. All right, and in doing so, they will be associated with less time to simply harbor or perhaps have large families or rear children for that matter. That is one. Now, secondly, we must also bear in mind that women who often have a higher level of education, they are often associated with career-oriented initiatives. All right, they are driven by that. And in doing so, it will influence their ideology, their perspective. They will tend to prioritize their lives rather than simply have children at a random point in time. And in doing so, this is a major mechanism which will distinguish, all right, those persons who have basic education level at a primary level as compared to those who have university level education or further. All right, so their priorities would tend to be completely different. All right, now moving on quickly, let's see, explain how an increase in the fertility rate may affect the country's ability to use its resources in a sustainable manner. This is a kind of question which is similar to what we did. Increases in the level of fertility would also be associated with increases in the birth rates, which will in fact increase the population number. All right, as a result, if there is an increase in the population number, there would be an increase in demands for food, for shelter, for clothing, for lateral space, and increases in terms of demands for manufacturing products as well. As a result, all right, the environment will be under siege, influenced negatively by the expansion processes to satiate the needs of the growing population. All right, let's go through quickly. Table 3. Table 3 shows data on the per capita waste production in two countries. We have A and B. All right. We understand per capita waste production. Per capita refers to per person. What is that? Per capita waste production is a term which refers to the amount of waste derived per person. All right. Often conceptualized within a period of 1 year. All right. Average number of waste per person. All right. Produced per person over a period of 1 year on average for the accountable purposes, that is. Now, which country, A or B, does waste production have a greater impact on the environment? Support your answer giving 3 reasons. This is actually part 2. All right. Let's go through quickly. Look carefully on the table. Now, I took the liberty, right, of calculating this for you all, and we can actually see that country A has a higher total per capita, right, waste production, all right, than that of country B. All right. So in which country, A or B, does waste production have a greater impact on the environment? First and foremost, country E would actually have a higher country E, all right, would actually have a higher total per capita waste production than that of country B. All right, that's number one. Now, the per capita municipal waste production in terms of tons, right, is in fact an estimated 10 times, I should say over 10 times higher, right, in country A than that of country B. All right. And well, I mean, given the information from the table, right, the third point I will simply say, well, we can see that the population size of country A is smaller than that of country B. So we cannot use the population size here. We already mentioned total per capita, and we already mentioned per capita municipal waste. But the third point will revolve around the fact that the per capita municipal waste, since it is higher for country A, right, that will be indicative of the fact that country A is in fact associated with a higher rate of consumption, all right, as well as a higher rate of waste production. All right. The higher rate of consumption would influence the waste production. All right. And that is the factor which will influence the total per capita waste, which will ultimately lead to country A being, all right, influenced by a greater impact upon the environment because of waste. All right. So this is in fact, class, the last paper for 2013. Last question, sorry, for 2013 module 2. Let us begin quickly with 2014 paper, Environmental Science, Unit 1, Paper 2, specifically looking at Module 2. All right, let's go through this quickly. Table 2 shows the data on the factors that are used to calculate Human Development Index for two countries, A and B, for the year 2011. Sorry. Now, Table 2 factors used to calculate Human Development Index for countries A and B. We are actually seeing both countries. We are actually seeing here the values for health, education, and life expectancy. Now, let's go through quickly what is meant by the Human Development Index. Hang on, let me scroll down here. This is in fact a blatant repeat based upon, I believe, is 2013 paper or 2012. We already mentioned this a couple of minutes ago. So that's a repeat right there. Now, make 4 deductions from the data presented in Table 2. I want you to take approximately a minute or two and look carefully at this particular table. Now, first and foremost, right, with respect to the table itself, if you have to make 4 deductions from the table, we can actually see here that the life expectancy for country B, right? The life expectancy for country B exceeds that of country E by an estimated, well, I mean, not estimated, by 19 years. All right. If you say 81.1 minus 62.1 in terms of year, that would actually be 19 years. So the life expectancy is in fact higher than in country B, sorry, than country E by 19 years. Okay. Now, secondly, we can actually see that the education values, right? The education values for country B, right? That parameter, country B, its education parameter is an estimated, well, I should say more than 2 times greater than that of country B. So literacy is in fact much more pronounced in country B than that of country E. Thirdly, we can actually see for health. If we look at the comparison for health, if you were to take the value, which is 0.964 for country B, and you divide that by 0.664, you will actually get 1.45 whatever, which is approximately 1.5. So you can say the health parameter associated with countries B is in fact 1.5 times greater, approximately 1.45 times greater than that of country A. All right. So it actually makes it a lot more significant. Last but not least, based upon the collective parameters here of health, education, life expectancy, it can be deduced that country B is said to be more developed, right, than that of country E. All right, for question B, educating women is a critical approach that can be used by countries for achieving the goal of sustainable development. Evaluate this statement, giving 4 points in your response. All right, so let's go through this quickly. Now, first and foremost, educated women are in fact those which simply make much more informed decisions as it relates to family planning initiatives. They actually tend to prioritize a lot more. And doing so, this will be related to achieving the goal of sustainable development primarily because they would not be associating themselves with having a large number of children or having large families. Now, secondly, we have to understand educated women are often those who are associated with a greater degree of independence, and as such, they may tend to employ, all right, practices which are associated with manageable families, having small family sizes. All right. The cultural approach of adopting or having large families would in fact be essentially in the back burner. All right. They would not necessarily gravitate towards that view. All right. Thirdly, we have to understand um, if women are said to be educated, this can have an impact upon their fertility rates, right? On average, fertility rate, especially given the fact that educated women are much more work oriented, and this would actually would result in a relatively low fertility rate for that particular environment, especially given the fact if women collectively adopt a similar approach. And last but not least, we have the birth rates. If the fertility rates are relatively low associated with educated women, we must also understand that the birth rates would also be relatively low. And this would in fact be a positive thing as it relates to sustainable development, primarily because there would not be any overpopulation or population explosions for that matter, which would affect the levels of productivity in that particular environment. Now, Part C, Figure 4 shows the per capita freshwater consumption for a country being from 1999 to the year 2004. All right. Now, I want to pay 1 or 2 minutes and look at this particular graph. We are seeing per capita freshwater consumption in cubic meters on the y-axis, and we are actually seeing the years on the x-axis. All right. Now you're actually observing an overall trend, an overall increase, right, in terms of per capita consumption of a particular country. Now let's go through quickly. State the meaning of the term per capita freshwater consumption. Now, per capita freshwater consumption is a term which refers to the amount of water which is consumed per person on average, fresh water that is, often conceptualized within a period of 1 year. Now, calculate the rate. Calculate the rate of per capita consumption of water for the period of 2000 to 2003. Let's go back to the diagram. Actually, meant table, sorry. All right, so let's go through quickly. All right, so we are talking about the rate of increase. All right, so from the year 2000 to the year 2003. All right, now students, for the year 2003, that would actually be somewhere across here. It is roughly, all right, it is roughly 450. So 450 minus the year 2000, it was estimated to be approximately 350. So 450 minus 350, that is cubic meter, of course, right? Divided by a period of 3 years. 2002 to 2003, that is 3 years. So we have 450 minus 350, which is in fact 100 divided by 3 years, which is actually 33.3 cubic meters. The actual rate of increase is actually 33.33 cubic meters. And that is per year. For the period of 2000 to 2003, right? 2000 to the year 2003. I'm going to cancel this. You will get 33.33. That is per year, which is cancelled to 1, 1. All right. So the rate of increase is associated with 33.33 cubic meters per year. All right, Patry says, suggests a plausible reason for the trend in per capita freshwater consumption in figure 4. We have to understand, as time progresses, all right, there would in fact be increases and perhaps improvements in technology and stuff like that. But in doing so, the consumption of resources could potentially still be relatively high. All right. So what I'm trying to say is that one plausible reason for the trend in per capita freshwater consumption would in fact be associated not necessarily for needs, but also associated with wants and recreational activities as such. All right. Because in today's world, people don't only consume for basic necessity. We also consume resources for the purpose of recreation, for the purpose of wants, for the purpose of desires, you name it. All right. And all of which can actually fall within the overall context of consumption. Okay. Now describe part 4 two possible environmental impacts on the freshwater reserve which could result in a trend in the consumption shown in figure 4. I actually meant which can result from the trend. All right. Now, first and foremost, if we are consuming, right, a lot of fresh water reserves, right, which is per person, per capita in that regard, we have to understand there will be a significant increase in wastewater, which will tantamount to an increase in aquatic pollution, all right, or perhaps marine pollution, or I should say water pollution generally. So there will be a significant increase in a potential, increase in water pollution, given the fact that the consumption and the utilization of this resource would in fact be associated with wastewater being generated. All right. Secondly, another possible environmental impact is that there can in fact be a greater degree of exploitation of groundwater resources. All right, and also the enhanced or the increase in utilization of this particular resource would tantamount to potential freshwater shortages in areas which are actually stricken by very harsh environmental conditions and low precipitation receipts. All right, so keep that in mind for me, please. All right, question 4 quickly. Everybody, I want you to pay attention to table 3. Look at table 3 for approximately 1 minute or maybe 2. Table 3 provides the data on infant mortality for 2 countries. We have country A and we have country B. We have the infant mortality rate at 16.4 and 29.7 respectively. Define the term infant mortality. Now, infant mortality is a term which actually conceptualizes the number of, well, the death of children under the age of 1 year or below 1 year of age. All right. And in terms of its actual rate, the infant mortality rate, we must bear in mind, this refers to the number of infants which basically well, infants' deaths, that is, which will basically die within an average of 1,000 live births. All right. So that's actually a very significant thing. Now, given a reason for your answer, state which country will have a faster growing population. This is a very important question. Now, I will actually go with country B. All right, even though country B has a higher infant mortality rate, I will go with country B. Reason being is because developing nations are associated with a higher rate of infant mortality, and as a result, these areas are associated with a high fertility and high birth rates, which will actually tantamount to an increase in the population progressively with time. All right, so that's the reason why I would choose country B. All right, they don't have family planning initiatives, but at the same time, these people they basically encourage and promote high numbers of high family numbers in that regard. Now let's go through quickly with respect to giving a reason for your answer. State which country is most likely a developing country. Now it would be country B. Country A has a lower infant mortality rate. Country B is developing because it has a higher infant mortality rate, and it is not considered to be developed because of the high value. All right, so it is still in its phase of development. All right, let's go through quickly. Um, okay, with respect to table 4, right? Some demographic data for a country. Pay attention to this particular table. Now we are seeing birth rates, death rates. Take approximately 1 minute. Pause the screen if you have to. We are seeing a period from 1990 all the way down to 2010, and we 10-year gaps as a matter of fact. Now the annual growth rate, as you can see from the trend here, you're taking the birth rate and the minus the death rate, and will actually be given the annual growth rate. For example, in the year 2000, year 2 minus 0.9 is actually 1.1, which is here, right? The same thing applies to 1.5 minus 0.7, you get 0.8. In the same regard, Let us simply calculate the 4.8 minus 2.2. You would actually get 2.6%. All right, keep that in mind for me. Now, we actually did that part of the calculation right there. Now, what is remember the term annual growth rate, annual population growth rate? That is essentially a term which refers to the amount, or the percentage increase, right, of a population, right, within an estimated period of 1 year. Okay, the percentage increase of a population within a period of 1 year. All right, let's go through. We actually calculated part 2 already as being 2.6%. Part 3, calculate the doubling time for a country for the year 2010. Now, students, the doubling time is equal to 70 divided by the rate. The rate is always in a percentage. So, what is the doubling time for the country in the year 2010? In the year 2010, you're taking 70 divided by 0.8. All right, let's see what we get there. The doubling time for the country for the year 2010 would actually be 87.5 years. That means it will take 87.5 years for the population to double by twofold. Now state the trend, part 4, in the annual population growth rate and describe one implication that it may have for the country. Now students, if the annual population growth rate from 1990 was in fact 2.6%, it dropped to 1.1, then 0.8. That growth trend is in fact associated with a very dramatic decline progressively within the 20-year period. It actually went below the replacement level fertility. And if that happens now, that means there can be a relatively a significant decline in the population, which could actually tantamount to reduce productivity. All right, and the country itself would have to resort to what we call a pro-natalistic policy. All right, and that's a very serious thing, as a matter of fact, especially if the country is economically dependent upon the population simply for the purpose of boosting their productivity and stuff like that. All right, let's go through quickly with respect to question part C, the last question for the entire paper. Discuss 2 impacts that increasing population growth rate have on less developed countries. First and foremost, remember, increasing population growth rates can in fact contribute to a rapid level of expansion, which can contribute to deforestation and by extension, resource consumption to a very, very large extent. And when this happens, the habitats can be fragmented and which can contribute to biodiversity loss. Secondly, this can actually increase in population growth rate can actually mean there is in fact more mouths to feed. However, our manufacturing and also production processes will also be subjected to increase to meet the demands of the population, which will ultimately result in increases in pollution, all right, in various forms, as a matter of fact, which will have a deleterious effect upon the environment. So students, I hope this was actually beneficial to you all. We already have in this particular video 2011, 12, 13, and 14. Any questions you have, feel free to let me know.